U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth says the U.S. military strikes against Iranian nuclear facilities were an incredible and overwhelming success, which took months as well as weeks of positioning in order to carry out. Hegseth said these strikes did not target Iranian troops or people, but they did obliterate Iran's nuclear ambitions.
Last night, on President Trump's orders, U.S. Central Command conducted a precision strike in the middle of the night against 3 nuclear facilities in Iran, Fordow, Natanz, and Esfahan, in order to destroy or severely degrade Iran's nuclear program. And as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs will demonstrate, it was an incredible and overwhelming success. The order we received from our commander-in-chief was focused, it was powerful, and it was clear. We devastated the Iranian nuclear program. But it's worth noting the operation did not target Iranian troops or the Iranian people. For the entirety of his time in office, President Trump has consistently stated for over 10 years that Iran must not get a nuclear weapon.
Let's further this discussion by welcoming Hügo Krüger Nuclear Engineer in order to help us further unpack the recent developments in the Middle East, with the United States now also confirming that it has successfully carried out attacks on 3 nuclear sites in Iran. So Hügo, what a great honor to have your expertise, insights as well today. First, I'd like us to specifically establish whether or not Iran does have, firstly, the capabilities, the research and even infrastructure of building a nuclear bomb, and were they even close to its completion as suggested by Israel, according to your knowledge?
No, they were not. There is no serious evidence that Iran has a nuclear weapons program. In fact, this is the position of the Director General of the International Atomic Energy Agency, the CIA, and the Mossad. We don't have a lot of time, but just to briefly explain it to your audience, it goes back to the Iran-Iraq War. Iran is the largest population since the First World War to have been subjected to chemical weapons. And when Ayatollah Khomeini came to power after the 79 revolution, he passed a fatwa against chemical and nuclear weapons. And this has been the official position of the Iranian government ever since then. It's been upheld by the current Supreme Leader, Ayatollah Khomeini. Iran does, however, have a policy of nuclear ambiguity, which is similar to South Africa's. But nobody in their right mind believes South Africa is a nuclear weapons state. Yes, we still have leftover materials from an atomic bomb, but there's no been an attempt to put it together. The CIA's own assessment in March confirmed that the best evidence they have goes back to a leftover program in 2003. So we are being sold a lie. I mean, a lie of the same proportions that lied America into the war of Iraq, of weapons of mass destruction. In fact, it's been done by the exact same people, which is Benjamin Netanyahu, which has been selling the lie of Iran for the last 30 years. So, you know, I don't believe a single word that they're saying. I say this working as a civil nuclear engineer, having family in Iran, speaking a bit of Persian, and having gone through the intelligence assessments. This is complete nonsense.
You know, Hügo, in one of your articles there, you actually argue a very valid point that South Africa could in fact use its stance on nuclear non-proliferation in order to put some more diplomatic pressure on Israel by in fact exposing, as you've just said, Israel's nuclear weapons arsenal. I was just speaking to an analyst earlier on, Dr. Kingsley, and raised the issue of South Africa possibly exploring alternative harsher measures on Israel. And your article, interestingly enough, was on very early on since the Hamas-Israel attack. And it seems, look, your advice fell on deaf ears, but it is even more relevant now.
Absolutely. Israel has between 100 and 200 nuclear weapons. It was assisted by the apartheid government in South Africa, by France, by the United States. And it has to be said that Benjamin Netanyahu has links to the Iranian smuggling mafia to the extent that the FBI has papers out for him. When he was at MIT, for example, he was involved in that. So Israel has nuclear weapons, many of them probably pointing at Iran. And there's a catch to this, which the Israelis don't want to hear. If it becomes fact, and by fact I mean officially acknowledged by the United States, who officially denies Israel's nuclear weapons program, that Israel does have nuclear weapons, then under existing American law, it's called the Symington-Glenn Amendments, all military aid must be suspended to Israel. And this can actually be enforced by the US Supreme Court. So in other words, if South Africa were to take a diplomatic stance internationally and use our BRICS partners and whatever international forum we have, because we probably can't do it alone through the African Union, and say we will accept a nuclear-free Middle Eastern zone, which is the official position of Iran and all Arab states, then Israel must open up their facilities for inspection. And you would demilitarize the Middle East. And that, in my view, should be the advice. That's the advice I gave to Gwedi Montashi in the article I wrote in Independent Online, and it was ignored at the time. But that's my advice to the South African government, is use your international pressure to call for the inspection of Israeli nuclear weapons. It will have ramifications for the Palestinians and the Iranians.
Now, Hügo, Iran has long said that their nuclear program actually is for the civilian as well as peaceful purposes, for example, their medicinal program. So let's explore what these potential uses could be.
Well, the distinction between military and nuclear and civilian is not always clear. That has to be said. And that's also true of South Africa, by the way. But for example, South Africa produces 20% of the world's cancer treating isotopes, often from leftover things from our nuclear weapons program. Iran, for example, is one of the leaders in what is called small modular reactor construction. They have about 20 gigawatts of reactors under construction. It's a domestic program. And at the same time, they have a reactor in Bushehr, which was initially started by, I believe, the Germans and then finished by the Americans. And then they ran into problems where they needed enrichment, and they started enriching domestically because the United States put pressure on France, notably to stop selling them fuel. And this is completely consistent with the charter of the International Atomic Energy Agency, but the Americans do not recognize the right of self-enrichment. And this is what they point to as part of the nuclear weapons program. Now, you can take a domestic enrichment program and scaling it up to 60 or 90%, and then you move in the direction of a bomb. But before you have a bomb, you need a bomb design, and you need 90% enrichment. You need a facility the size of a rugby field. They don't have that at the moment, but they do have some enriched uranium that they can theoretically transfer into a bomb. However, Iran does not have an official policy, and until there's a change in policy by the supreme leader, there should not be any concern. And this is not my view. This is the view of the CIA.
And speaking of concern, Hügo, I mean, what would be at stake if indeed there was a nuclear exchange eventually? What are the dangers associated with nuclear usage, and what are the potential risks, the gravity of the impact, not just for civilians, but globally? I read a statement from Iranian authorities where they were basically saying they wouldn't even consider this, as it would be detrimental to its own citizens.
Nuclear weapons, there's only been 2 test cases, maybe 3, which is Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and the US Marshall Islands. And we have very limited data actually on the direct impact on humans because of the way the Second World War collected data in the aftermath. The long-term fallout is probably exaggerated, but in the immediate aftermath, people will burn to ashes if a nuclear bomb falls on a city. And then there's also a theory which is called nuclear winter, which is if you bomb a city the size of Johannesburg, Pretoria, or Tehran, for example, the smog will go into the stratosphere, and that will spread around the planet, cause winter, and it can cause the collapse of global agriculture. So it can cause famine. Those are the consequences that we face, okay? And at the moment, the countries who have nuclear weapons, which is the United States and Israel, are the ones doing the bombing. Iran is retaliating in defense, actually, because they were attacked.
Absolutely, Hügo. So now there's been this question, right? It might seem like a very simple question, but for clarity there, Hügo, maybe talk to us about the difference between an atomic as well as a nuclear bomb, because everybody's just trying to understand why such a huge fuss about a nuclear weapon or an arsenal versus the atomic one. Who is the lesser evil?
The atomic is just another name for nuclear, but you have different levels of nuclear bombs, and I suppose what you're referring to there is what they call tactical nuclear weapons. These are theoretically smaller scale nuclear weapons, but they've never been used before, so we don't know the consequences of them. But the Israelis have threatened to use them. and so has the United States. They even threatened at one stage to give it to Ukraine against the Russians. Yeah, I mean, the crux of it is nuclear weapons have a disproportionate power, and they will wipe out a great percentage of the population of any city. And as for what is the aftermath, that is still academic because nobody has really tested it on that grand scale. We only have 2 test cases, which is Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and that's 70 years ago. Okay, but these are things that nobody would like to repeat. People would like to avoid it. And my solution is, and this is what I think South Africa should push for, is that diplomats must now make their argument to say you need to stop this war before it gets out of hand. It's already getting out of hand. The Iranians, from what I know, they have a very deep nationalism. It goes, as a civilization, goes back 6,000 years. During the Iran-Iraq war, they fought until 14, 16-year-olds were conscripted. So we are preparing ourselves, even if this is a conventional war, for a bloodbath of epic proportions. Iran, for example, can shoot missiles on the other side of the Persian Gulf and take the world's oil economy with it. There's a lot of ramifications and at stake of this war. And I believe that people need to call for peace. And the fastest way to do it, in my view, is to get nuclear weapons out of the Middle East entirely. And that includes inspections on Iran and Israel. And that add Israel part is what's missing in the equation at the moment.
Hügo, thank you so much for your input this afternoon. That is Mr. Hügo Krüger there, a nuclear engineer, on the dangers also associated with nuclear weapons as well as risks to civilians.